So today I have my lovely boyfriend Ian with me, and we are going to do a book review on books about depression because Ian is writing his dissertation on depression, so he has done a lot of research and read a lot of books. So, good for you guys. So let's go ahead and just get into it.
Cool. So I'm actually writing my dissertation in philosophy on depression. So some of the stuff that I've read is not like straightforwardly psychological research, although I have read a lot of that stuff. But most of the stuff I want to recommend today is going to be not like real psych heavy. So, and hopefully it's going to be stuff that maybe people are like less familiar with. Um, so yeah, and also if people are interested, like I'm only going to recommend 5 books here, but I could recommend like 700 or something. So if there's more stuff that people are interested in, or maybe particular topics, like especially about like the history of depression or like cross-cultural studies on depression, all kinds of stuff like that, I'd be like more than happy to give people recommendations if they're interested. So just feel free to leave a comment. So the first one that I'm going to recommend is one people are probably like familiar with or might be familiar with, which is the Noonday Demon. And if there's one book on depression that people should read if they're interested in the topic, it's this. For one thing, it's like encyclopedic. It's huge, but Solomon is a really, really good writer. He was a novelist before he wrote this, and it reads really snappily. And so yeah, don't be put off by it. It's just like gargantuan size. I like a lot of things about it. For one thing, so Solomon has first personal experience with like very severe depression. Went through like 3 pretty serious like crises, depressive episodes. Was suicidal. Had to be hospitalized if I recall. All kinds of stuff. So he knows whereof he speaks, and that's really a valuable aspect of this. And what I like about it too is that the breadth of his coverage. Like he not only talks about what it was like to experience depression for himself, but he talks about like everything that like he condenses like 100 years of psychological and neurochemical studies of depression in a very like readable way. So if you're interested in that and like how antidepressants work and like how they were discovered and all this kind of stuff, well, he covers that. He covers the history going all the way back to like Hippocrates and the ancient Greeks and Galen and all these people through the medieval period up to the present day. He talks about like the demographics of depression. He talks about he has a really, really illuminating chapter on suicide that I think is worth reading. So yeah, so if you want just like the definitive book on depression written by a layperson but somebody with like clearly a ton of knowledge, this is I think the place to go. And it's widely available. I got this for like $6. But yeah, it's really good. And like I said, it's really beautifully written. I guess my only critique of him is that he's like kind of melodramatic, which he admits to. So that might be off-putting to some people. There were times where I kind of just wanted to like grab him by the shoulders and just be like, stop. So I don't know if that really gets to you. He can be a little irritating at times. But if you really want to know like everything there is to fucking know about depression, pick that up. And speaking of memoirs, the second one I want to recommend. So. Part of my recommendations are constrained by the fact that this is the stuff I have on hand. Some of the stuff I got from the library, right, and it's been returned. But there's a million really good memoirs on depression, and this is kind of an early famous one called Darkness Visible by a novelist, William Styron, who wrote Sophie's Choice, which people might be familiar with. This is nice and short. It was like a Vanity Fair article that he just published as a book. And it's famous because it's kind of one of the earliest depression memoirs, and it was written by a man, which is was kind of a breakthrough because depression was kind of seen as a woman's illness for a long time, and sort of still is. He wrote it after Primo Levi, the famous Holocaust survivor, killed himself in like the mid-'80s, and people were kind of mystified by that. So Styron wrote this book about his experience with depression to kind of clarify, like, look, this is an illness. I've suffered from it. It doesn't mean you're weak. Like, and he goes into like he doesn't go into a lot of scientific detail or historical detail or anything like that. It's really just his own personal experience with suffering from like a really serious depressive crisis when he was like in his 50s, and it's really worth reading. Yeah, there's, like I said, there's a lot of good memoirs on depression. There's a recent one by a woman whose name I can't remember called Shoot the Damn Dog. That's really good. Jesus, there's like dozens and dozens of them. But yeah, this is just kind of a canonical one, and like, I mean, you can read it in an afternoon. Um, it was written in the 80s. It's like some of the, what he says is like maybe a little out of date or something like this, but yeah. If you want to know kind of like you're feeling sort of like, you know, you're crazy or something, you want to have someone to relate to, he's like a nice figure for that. So those two are sort of more straight ahead kinds of things that don't require any background knowledge. One kind of philosophical recommendation that I have is this book called The Disordered Mind by a philosopher named George Graham. He teaches at Georgia State University, which has a very well-regarded like neurophilosophy program. And Graham's book is kind of wrestling more with like the notion of mental illness generally and trying to understand a bunch of philosophical puzzles about it. And anybody who's interested in sort of what philosophers think about mental illness and psychiatry generally, and things like the DSM and all these controversies that are, you know, come along with that stuff, would be well pressed to pick this up. It's a kind of introductory sort of textbook. It says it's an introduction to the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of mental illness. So it's very readable even for somebody who doesn't have a lot of like sort of technical analytic philosophy background. But yeah, it kind of, I mean, he defends a particular view of what mental illness is, but it's really nice just to kind of get a sense for some of the like the puzzles about mental illness and psychiatry and how the mind works that people are still really wrestling with. Mental illness doesn't really fit nicely into like our normal categories of like illness and disease, and so that raises a lot of interesting questions. So for instance, you might think, like, what a question philosophers are really interested in is like what is health and what is disease, what is illness, and sort of a kind of a naive thought there, or not really a naive thought, but a very promising thought is like, well, to be healthy is for everything to sort of be functioning properly, and for it to be ill is for things to be like not functioning properly, like disordered in some sense, and that'll get you pretty far in some cases. But it doesn't apply super well to the mind for a couple of reasons. One is that, well, the functions of various aspects of the mind are sort of poorly understood and really speculative. You know, like what are moods for instance? What is it for your mood to be functioning properly? Things like that. Another thing is that it doesn't seem like dysfunction is like a sufficient criterion for illness. So people will be aware that like homosexuality was formerly classified as a mental illness in the DSM on the grounds that it was dysfunctional or thought to be dysfunctional, right? And it's no longer thought to be the product of a dysfunction, but the important point is that even if it were a dysfunction, or even if like not identifying with like your birth gender or something were a dysfunction, that wouldn't be sufficient to make it an illness, right? There seems to be something else. We wouldn't want to call people who are, you know, attracted to members of the same sex, you know, ill simply because their like sexual orientation mechanism wasn't functioning properly. So it seems like some notion of harm needs to be included there. So it seems like an illness should be something that's dysfunction that causes harm. But again, that's going to raise trouble. Some mental illnesses don't necessarily seem to cause harm, or at least it's kind of like not obviously so. So like narcissistic personality disorder maybe isn't harmful to the person who has it. I mean, right, this is just, there are ways to finesse that, but you know, you might think that. Or somebody who like sort of like a tortured artist who really identifies with their depression, maybe might, you know, not be necessarily harmed by it, and yet we might want to still say that the depression they have is an illness. So anyway, these are like all the kinds of like puzzles and stuff that you can get yourself into if you start thinking about this stuff carefully, and there's a lot that philosophers have written on this, especially recently, so that the Graham book is a good place to start. I could go on and on for hours about that, but I won't. The next book I want to recommend is, if there's one book on the psychology of depression, written by a psychologist who I want to say, I can't remember where he teaches, UCLA or something. If there's one book I would recommend, it's this. It's a recent one. It came out in 2014. It's called The Depths. It's by a guy, Jonathan Rottenberg. It's another real quick read. It's maybe about 200 pages. It goes really fast. I've like highlighted like every sentence in this book. It's really, really, really illuminating. He gives a kind of evolutionary explanation for depression that I think is like really insightful and tempting. He goes through tons and tons of. Basically, his take is that a lot of the psychological research on depression doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. Antidepressants don't work that well. They don't work for everybody. We've been studying this stuff for like 60 years now, and we're not necessarily making a great deal of progress. Depression is like increasingly more prevalent. So it seems like we have kind of a crisis on our hands. And so Rottenberg wants to go back to square one and kind of like rethink everything we think we know about depression, using evolution as kind of a, theory of natural selection as like a way to kind of structure his discussion, and it's really, really good. Like, I couldn't put this down. I feel like I've learned so much from reading it. So I would recommend that too. It's a good intro to the psychological study of depression written by somebody who really knows their shit. So I would pick that up too if you're interested in kind of a deeper understanding of like what depression is, where it comes from, why it's so prevalent, stuff like that. So finally, the last thing I want to recommend is there's a philosopher named Jennifer Radin who has spent her career talking about mental illness and depression. And this is a collection of her essays that you can get like on Amazon and stuff. And I think her stuff is really insightful. She spends a lot of time going through the history of people's concept of depression, and formerly like melancholia, and the medieval notion of acedia, which kind of maps onto depression, but not exactly. And so, yeah, she has all kinds of interesting stuff to say. It's impossible to really summarize this book in a nutshell. I mean, she talks about like women's particular experiences of depression, which is really interesting. She talks about the history of the notion of depression, whether what people used to call melancholia is the same thing as what we today recognize as depression, or whether they're different in some interesting way. She writes a lot about Burton, who, if I had it with me, I would recommend too. A lot of people are familiar with his Robert Burton's famous The Anatomy of Melancholy, which was written in like the 1600s, and is this like vast encyclopedia of all the knowledge on like melancholia of the day. It's also just like a work of literature. She writes a lot about that and about Burton's understanding of depression or of melancholia. Yeah, she kind of wades into some contemporary debates too about like, so people often, I was going to recommend one more book, anyway, I can mention it. It's called The Loss of Sadness. So there's a big debate about whether the DSM is like too liberal in its classification of depression, whether it's like overclassifying like ordinary sadness as depression, as like an unhealthy state when they shouldn't be doing that. And Radin spends a lot of time wading into that debate, and that book, The Loss of Sadness, which is written by two psychiatrists, is this like very polemical take on that debate, and they think the DSM has made a huge mistake and that we're like medicating far too many people for depression. And without taking a stand on that, personally, I think that their discussion is really interesting and is worth picking up too. So maybe we could leave a note about that in the what do you call it? Description, yeah. Of the title of their book too, because it might be worth picking up if you're interested in that, or if you've ever worried about that, or wondered what psychiatrists think about that, and how do we draw the line between like healthy depression, like healthy sadness, and like clinical depression, and they spend a lot of time talking about grief, and so there's a lot of interesting stuff in there too. And like I said, Radin picks up all that kind of stuff too, but from a more philosophical standpoint. So those are the 5 or 5.5, I guess, books that I've got here to recommend. Like I said, if there's other stuff people are interested in, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to recommend more stuff. I hope this wasn't just like me just rambling incoherently for going on 15 minutes now. But yeah, there's like a ton of good shit out there on depression, and this is just stuff that I found really insightful and useful for my own research. And like I said, I'm a philosopher, so the stuff that I might find interesting is maybe not necessarily stuff that other people find interesting, but yeah, I guess that's all I got.
Okay, cool. So I will leave the names of these books and the authors in the description also, so you guys can easily look them up on Amazon or wherever you might get your books from. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and please give this a like if you liked it, and leave a comment below if you have something to say, which you should, because comments are great. So anyways, I guess I will see you all in my next video. Bye.
See ya.